Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. My name is Phil Smith, and I'm an artist, which means what I'm about to say is going to be somewhat ironic. There we go. And that is that until my mid-30s or so, I didn't think the arts were particularly important, certainly not when compared to science, engineering, history, politics. I've since changed my mind about that. I think the arts are very critical, in fact, in part because it combines the intellectual and the emotional in an effort to try to communicate the complex. There it goes. The Aristotle quote here is important when looking at any kind of artwork, but it's particularly salient when you're talking about artwork that's aiming to depict our future in space. What I mean by that is don't fixate on the details. A lot of people do that. After all, it is about the future. What's more important is to think about the essence of what's being illustrated, that at some point in the future, people will live, work, and play in space. And I believe the story starts in 1609 when Englishman Thomas Harriot aimed his telescope at the moon. And for the first time, a celestial body was rendered in a drawing. And what he did is he drew mountains, plains, craters. The moon transforms from a heavenly sphere into a place, an actual place. And if it's a physical place, then maybe it can be a destination. And sure enough, 2 centuries later, Jules Verne, an author, wrote a story about a journey to the moon. During that same century, we have astronomers that aim telescopes at Mars, and they believe they see canals on Mars. Presumably a civilization lives there. Maybe Mars can be a destination as well. Verne goes on to inspire several individuals that are key to our story about spaceflight. In particular, Constantine Ziolkowski, who is the first person to invent the liquid-fueled staged rocket. He doesn't build one, however, but he is correct in surmising that we'll need a rocket to leave the Earth. But in Tsarist Russia, communications were not particularly good, so a lot of people didn't hear about this gentleman's invention until many years later. Robert Goddard, an American, also inspired Verne and to a certain extent H.G. Wells. He, unaware of Tsiolkovsky's work, goes on to invent the liquid-fueled staged rocket as well. This time, though, he actually builds a functioning machine and launches it in 1926. But Goddard works quietly, so his work is not fully understood or appreciated, and his impact on spaceflight is fairly limited. 2 other people worthy of note. Hermann Oberth was inspired by Verne. Unaware of Tsiolkovsky and Goddard's work, he invents the liquid-fueled staged rocket as well. This time, though, he publishes his work in 1923, and now people around the world are starting to learn about this wondrous machine. He takes under his wing a young man, a boy wonder, Verner von Braun, who is also inspired by Jules Verne, but he wants to take it a step further. He wants to go to Mars. These 2 gentlemen and a group of others work together in a rocket group in Germany, tinkering around with rockets, and they run out of funds, basically, in the late 1920s. But in Germany, Nazi Party gains power. There's a gentleman named Colonel Walter Dornberger that sees that this rocket has some degree of potential, and now the funding starts to come. Verner von Braun heads up a team that develops the world's first liquid-fuel ballistic missile, and that missile becomes the first man-made object to enter space in October 1942. It's a Faustian bargain. He needs the money to make his peaceful realization of human spaceflight a reality by creating missiles that are designed to destroy and kill. But Germany loses the war in 1945. He and his team surrender to the Americans. He believes that America is the place to go to realize his dreams, not the Soviet Union. It's important to note in the 30s and 40s that human spaceflight was considered ridiculous. The artwork of the time, for example, depicted machines that operated on impossible physics and creatures with impossible biologies. Verner von Braun was in Fort Bliss, Texas, while the Army awaited trying to figure out what to do with their skill sets. And during that time, he writes a book, his master plan on how to go to Mars, published in 1948, but a lot of people haven't read it. In the meantime, we have this gentleman, an artist, Chesley Bonestell, works in an architectural firm, and he goes on to become a matte artist in Hollywood. He paints various pictures for The Fountainhead, for Citizen Kane, and other movies, but he's also exploring his passion for astronomy, and he does a lot of astronomical artworks, following in the footsteps of French artist Lucien Roudeau. Von Braun notices that there are people out there that aren't really following in this idea of human spaceflight, and he notices artwork, in particular that of Chesley Bonestell, and they work together, and he brings some engineer friends together, and they start writing articles about the fact that we can make human spaceflight now, that this is a possibility. And this is produced under the title Man Will Conquer Space Soon in the Collier series. Walt Disney, who is intrigued by the future, he is particularly intrigued by human spaceflight because it's very dramatic. And so he taps Von Braun and his team and says, look, we'll make some films here and you can sell this idea of yours. So using artwork, animation, scale models, he starts to tell the story about human spaceflight. The foundation is laid. It's important to note that in the 1950s, the artwork depicting human spaceflight starts to become a lot more realistic, but there's still that fantastic flair to it. In fact, it's interesting because the industrial design of this period starts to tap that. We start to see the chrome and the fins on cars. Fashion and furniture start to be influenced. But the foundation is being laid. People are starting to believe that this is actually possible. But there's a spark that's needed to get this ball rolling. I need the funding to make my vision happen. Spark comes on October 4th, 1957, when Sputnik goes up. The Soviets beat the Americans to space. How could this be? How could this be possible? But the spark is there. Now we need the funding. The US government starts to mobilize for its effort. What that comes down to is in January of 1958, the United States launches its first satellite. But it isn't enough. And by the end of that particular decade, or that particular year, NASA is founded for peaceful exploration of space. And Verner von Braun is part of NASA. So now he's starting to see, my goodness, my vision is going to start to come to pass. But it still isn't enough, because it's not about satellites for von Braun. It's a little bit more. So in 1961, in April, Yuri Gagarin goes into space. The Soviets beat us again. Gagarin becomes the first human to go into space. The US follows up with Alan Shepard's flight in May. The following month, President Kennedy makes his famous announcement that the United States is going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade is out. Now the game is on, the race is up, and the funding starts to flow. Notice the artwork here. It's more technically accurate. That's because we have actual hardware and we have actual astronauts training to fly in the hardware. Now we have true inspiration for the artists, and the art is revealed here to be more realistic. Note also the artwork with the astronaut in space. That's Alexei Leonov painted that. He's the first artist that goes into space when he goes up on Voskhod 2. He takes up colored pencils and he sketches a sunset. Alan Bean returns from the moon on Apollo 12, and he retires immediately to pursue his passion, painting. He is inspired by his journey to the moon. In the 1970s, we see a new type of rendering. Apollo is over, and we start to see this idea of a space plane emerge. This is inspiring for a lot of people because they understand what airplanes are, and this looks a lot like that. We also have the environmental movement emerging, this idea of overpopulation and using up the resources of the Earth. And now we have these grandiose paintings and depictions of colonies in space, the famous L5 or Stanford Taurus being an example. We also have this idea of space stations again. Maybe this space plane can take it up. And sure enough, it starts to happen. We start to develop more accurate visions of the future. One here that's probably famous to a lot are Bob McCall's paintings, effervescent and colorful. Space is a promising utopia for a lot of people in this regard. We also have a lot of probes out there, in particular Voyager. Voyager does the grand tour of the solar system, and now we have more accurate ideas of what the planets look like. In the 1990s, the space shuttle becomes a fixture in the artwork because it's always around. For 30 years, it becomes a fixture. We also see the emergence of the idea of commercialization of space. We start to see a lot more artwork depicting, in particular, mining in space. We also see artwork showing human colonization of Mars, this constant desire to colonize Mars. Mars, interestingly, in artwork is always redder than the planet actually is, which is an interesting thing to observe. The 21st century, one big thing that happens is we no longer have the Cold War rivalry between countries that aim to conquer space. We have a sort of corporate titans battling it out to get into space at this point. So we back up a little bit, 1975, I obviously pick up some crayons, watercolors or something like that, and I develop a passion for art. And I also develop a passion, like all other kids do, with space and dinosaurs. Space wins out. But I'm not a terribly good student. I don't apply myself very well. I want to be an astronaut. It takes a while for me to realize that isn't going to come to pass. But you know what? I can work in the industry probably, and maybe I can use the art, and I'm okay with that. An interesting thing is I started to do the space art thing in 1998 with some degree of seriousness. In 2006, I get my first contract dedicated to doing space art. And the interesting thing is with that is the Air Force client wanted me to do marker sketches. He liked the idea of this nostalgia of recreating spaceships and this sort of thing in that kind of genre of 1950, 1960. And I realized at that point that the traditional media, because I love traditional media, it provides an intimacy, a way of communicating with people using ordinary technologies to explain the extraordinary or the exotic. And then I grudgingly start to get into digital art. I like the feel I like the tactile sensation of doing artwork. I like the smell of oils, the wood of the pencils. But I had to learn how to do this. The kids, after all, are doing it. And the beauty of this is the fear of screwing up is gone because I can use the undo feature. So I can also produce artwork very quickly for clients. But in the end, it's important to note that the arts aren't just a critical part. It's the most important part. To conceptualize, to model, to create ideas out of thin air. It's essential to inspiring others to actually build the things that we're looking for. The arts, we can't live without the arts. The arts inspire us. And you know, I try to think about a way to articulate this. And the best way that I can come up with, and I lost my train of thought there, which is very common with an artist, I guess you would say. But without the arts, we couldn't create, we couldn't build civilization. And without the arts, we couldn't fly. And if we can't fly, we can't venture above the clouds. And we can't go through the wild blue and into the black beyond. We will always need artists. And that's it. I thank you for your attention.